But you're criticizing communism. So what the fuck are you talking about? All right. So we're talking about Toussaint. These bewildering political leaders, Toussaint brought his superior knowledge to the political vices which usually accompanied it. So here we go. The slaves had revolted because they wanted to be free, but no ruling class ever admitted such things. The white concades accused the patriots and the friends of black people of stirring up the revolt, while the red concades accused the royalists and the counter-revolution in France. Small whites accused the biracial people and massacred them at sight in the streets. The Assembly took charge of the colony. It could not ask France for assistance, but sent envoys to the British at Jamaica, to the Spaniards, and to the United States. It did not fear the revolution. It was more afraid of slaves in Le Cap and the city ramble, always ready to foment anarchy for the chance of plunder. These small whites refused to fight unless they were given 2/3 of what they found on the plantation as booty. But the majority of the biracial people, anxious about their property, volunteered to serve and offered their wives and children as hostages in token of good faith. The Assembly, knowing nothing as yet of September 24th reversal, promised not only to enforce the decree of May 15th, but to extend it to all biracial people, whether their parents are free or not. But this could only be done, said the Assembly, after the decree had reached the colony and when the troubles were over. To deceive the biracial, the planters were trying tricks, but against the slaves they knew only one weapon: terror. Black people had their stockades covered with the heads of white victims. The colonial assembly stuck the heads of black people on pikes, placing all along the road leading to Le Cap. When Boukman was killed fighting bravely, the assembly stuck his head in Le Cap with a placard, quote, "This is the head of Boukman, chief of the rebels," end quote. The whites built 3 scaffolds in Le Cap, and broke 20 to 30 black people on the wheel every day. With their usual discard of the slave even as property, they massacred all they met, even those on plantations which have not yet revolted. Masters denounced those who had helped them to escape, slaves presenting themselves to their masters seeking refuge for the devastation of the countryside, or merely because they were afraid or tired of revolution, were killed at sight. The result was that all, timid as well as bold, soon understood that there was no hope except with the revolution, and they flocked to join its ranks. In a few weeks, the insurgents had grown to nearly 100,000. To help the slaves and confuse the white planters came news of biracial revolution in the West. Early August, a body of biracial people, wary of being persecuted and lynched by the small whites, now lording it as officials in the revolutionary municipalities, crept out of Port-au-Prince and assembled at La Croix des Banquets, a district about 5 miles from the capital. From all parts of the West Province, the biracial people began to send contingents there, and with their education, not so widespread as among the whites, but immensely superior to the half-wild black people. They at once found admirable leadership. The most famous of them was Regard, a genuine biracial person.
You had to write the first time, Regard.
That's the name.
Yeah, you had to write the first time. It was Regard.
There's no R. Are you there?
It's regard. Rigaud. Regard.
Regard. A genuine biracial. That is to say, the son of a white and a black person. He had a good education in Bordeaux, and then learned the trade of a goldsmith. Unlike Toussaint, Jean Francisco, and Bassou, he was already a trained soldier. He had enlisted as a volunteer in the French army, which fought in the American War of Independence, became a non-commissioned officer, and had also seen service in Guadeloupe. He hated the whites, not only for the indignance which he, an educated and widely traveled soldier, had to suffer, but also because they were jealous of his goldsmith's business. In those days, an important trade. A very different type of man was Beauvais, Beauvais. He was a member of a biracial family, which had long been freed and rich. He also had been educated in France, had volunteered for service, and fought as a non-commissioned officer in the American War of Independence. On his return, oh my gosh, I already got an appeal to have to do. Jesus. Here we go. All right. Okay, hold on. He was a member of a biracial family which had long been rich and free. He also had been educated in France, had volunteered for service, and fought on a non-commissioned officer in the American War of Independence. On his return home, he had taken up teaching. He was not only a man of exceptional personal bravery, tall, of a fine figure, and distinguished presence. He was known as one of the homesomest men in San Domingo, men in San Domingo, and in that, oh my gosh, what's this word? Licentious age. And is that right? Did I get it right?
Yeah, it sounded right.
And country, he was distinguished for the severity of his mode of life and the charm of his manner. His own people loved him, and it would not be difficult for the whites, when in a corner, to forget his color. These were the two soldiers. The politician was Pinchant, who had studied widely in France. And the first day of the revolution, he came back to San Domingo to lead the biracial people. In 1791, he was already 60, a man loving play and losing life, and hated the whites with all the hatred of a vicious character. He was a most finished politician, when well deserved the qualification of man of genius, given to him by Pyphiel de Lacrosse. Quote, what a man to write and to make treaties, end quote. Another biracial leader would write to him, quote, he is unique, end quote. Under such leaders and trained to fight in the, oh my gosh, here's a Marachessia, which is in French, the biracial people were a formidable force. For this reason, the royalist counter-revolution in the West at once sought to make use of them. Humus D. Jamacourt, commandant of the district of La Croix des Blanquets and Col de Sac, purposed an alliance guaranteed them all their rights in return for support of the counter-revolution, or, as he would call it, the lawful government of the island. Pinchnat, I don't know how to say the word, Pinchinat, refused, but offered instead a united front against their common enemy, the municipality of Port-au-Prince and the Providence Assembly of the West. De Jamacourt agreed, and the royalist commandants of the rich whites of the West began to join the biracial people at La Croix des Blanquets. There were a few free black people holding high command in this troop, so that despised black person were now commanding whites. The biracial people also incorporated in their force a body of maroons, nicknamed, quote, the Swiss, end quote, in imitation of the bodyguard of Louis, let's see here, the 14th, full of contempt for men of color, and hated them now for their persistent royalism and patriot attacked La Croix des Banquins. I think this is the name of the town. They were heavily defeated. The Swiss, quote unquote, fighting with great bravery. A few days later, the biracial people and the whites of the surrounding districts had a meeting at La Croix des Banquets, where the biracial people, they call them the N-words, which I'm not going to use, put before the whites the draft of the Concordat, embodying their demands for complete equality. The ninth and last clause consisted of 4 words, quote, if not civil war, end quote. The whites accepted their demands immediately. Wind Maroons, yes, Wind Maroons. Fun fact, your father was in, okay, nice. Sweet. The Patriots of San Domingo. Everybody forgive me for not pronouncing French words correctly and other words correctly, like Creole and stuff. So I apologize. But I'll try. The Patriots of San Domingo were always ready to forget race prejudice and return for something solid. After he had been defeated in the field, Caradu, leader of the Patriots, offered Vinvesa biracial rights in return for agreement of independence without the intervention of the royalists. Biveas refused, but this time, nearly all the rich planters had deserted the Patriots, and even the rich merchants in Port-au-Prince would have nothing to do with them. On August 19th, the Concordat, embodying all the biracial demands, was signed by all parties. The Provincial Assembly of the West was to be dissolved immediately. The white deputies from the West Province to the Colonial Assembly were to be recalled. 2 battalions of the National Guard were to be recruited among the biracial people. The memory of OGE was to be rehabilitated in the whole presence for the ratification of the National Assembly and the approval of the king. The leader of the whites extended the hand of friendship. Quote, we bring you final words of peace. We come no longer to bargain with you. We come only to accord to your demands. We come animated by the spirit of justice and peace to give you authentic recognition of your rights, to ask you to see in the white citizens only friends and brothers whom the colony in danger begs you to unite with in order to bring prompt assistance to our troubles. We accept entirely and without any reserves the Concordat that you propose to us. Unfortunately, circumstances of which you are doubtless aware made us hesitate for a moment, but our courage has broken all obstacles, and we have imposed silence on all means of prejudice, on the petty desire of domination. May the day on which the torch of reason has enlightened us all to be forever memorable. May it be a day of forgetfulness for all errors, a pardon of all injuries. Let us henceforth be combatants only in zeal for the public welfare, end quote. L. France, yeah. The mean prejudices and the petty desire for domination were the small whites who saw themselves being pushed into the background. But the news of the slave revolution in the North had sobered all who owned slaves, and they wanted peace. All the 14 parish of the West Providence accepted the terms, and on the 24th of October, the great ceremony of reconciliation took place in Port-au-Prince. The leaders of the whites and the leaders of the biracial people marched into Port-au-Prince, arm in arm, with their troops marching behind, greeted with salvos of artillery and mutual shouts of unity and fidelity. In the general excitement, a captain of a white National Guard jumped on a gun carriage and proclaimed Quadu commander of the National Guard of West Province. There was loud applause, which was renewed when he named Bueves second in command. Then all went to the church to celebrate with the Del Deum as stipulated in the Concordat. One more difficulty remained: the Swiss, quote unquote. What was to be done with them? The whites argued that to send them back to the plantations would be bad for the slaves, and it was agreed to deport them to a deserted beach in Mexico. Damn. Among the leaders, Regard and Petition biracials fought for the Swiss. Lambert, a free black person, supported the deportation. The Swiss out of the way, peace seemed assured, biracial rights guaranteed, and the counter-revolution well placed for action. But in Le Cap, the assembly foamed with wrath at these ongoings-on. In the West, the royalist commanders of the local forces, M.D. Rivera, a M.D., these are all people's name, Tauzard, urged the patriots in the North to grant biracial people rights. Quote, but you will say, must we yield to the menace of an inferior caste, admit it to civic rights as a ransom for the evils which they caused us? One day, said D. Rovira, quote, the scornful laugh with which you greet the important truths which I dare to tell you will change into tears of blood. In the war of 1756, England wished to seize Cuba, and Lord Albemarle was ordered to besiege Havana. He landed with 16,000 men 6 months after he had only 1,800. Quote, where, I ask you, is the army capable of fulfilling our aim? End quote. Have you any others than the biracial peoples? No. Well, why do you reject the help which they offer? End quote. Another quote. I am not finished. I have some other truths to tell you. I should tell them to you. France, at this moment, has her eyes fixed on San Domingo. It is impossible that the claims of the biracial people will not be listed to in France. If even they were unjust, they will be welcomed. The constitutional decree that you suppose irrevocable, that you regard as your pallidum, will be inevitably modified. The assembly promised to give the biracial people their rights, but after the troubles were over, true was where there was a slave revolt. They had appealed to France by now, and to give rights to biracial people who outnumbered them would be to hand over the colony, military and civil, to these bastards upstairs and their allies of the counter-revolution. They could see the results of that unholy alliance in the West. They had D. Blanchy Ladi, the governor, in their power, and they poured out their wrath on the Concordat. The West would not budge from their unity and repudiated the proclamation of the assembly of the governor. But 6 days after the ceremony of reconciliation, they arrived in the colony, the decree of the 24th September, by which the constituents had withdrawn all rights from the biracial peoples and once more put their fate in the hands of white colonists. Quote, mean prejudices, and, quote, the petty desire for domination reared its head again, and the scarcely healed wounds reopened. The intrigues of Barnave and company were coming home to roost. The 21st November was fixed for the ratification of the Concordat. Port-au-Prince was divided into 4 sections for the voting, and three had already voted in favor of ratification. This for the small whites was ruined, and Prolato and his band were on the lookout to create some cause for a breach. It came over to free black people. Oh my gosh, I have to appeal again. Jesus Christ. A member of the biracial force who was either insulted by or insulted some whites. He was immediately captured and hanged. Despite the modernization of the biracial peoples, fighting began in the streets. The biracial peoples, taken up surprise, retreated. Fire broke out in the city, for which they were made responsible. Paralato and his followers massacred rich white citizens, biracial peoples, men, women, and children, and plundered the wealthy quarters of the town, while the flames spread and burned 2/3 of Port-au-Prince to the ground, estimating at a loss of 50 million francs. The biracial peoples had been very patient and forbearing, but now they seemed to go wild. Pinchinat, the man of proclamations, issued a ringing call for battle. Quote, fly, my friends, to the siege of Port-au-Prince, and let us plunge our bleeding arms, avengers of perjury and purified, right? Perfidy, sorry, into the beasts of these monsters from Europe. Too much and too long have we served as sports for their passion and their insidious maneuverers. Wait, is that right? Yeah. Too much and too long have we grown under this iron yoke. Let us destroy our tyrants. Let us bury with them even the smallest vestige of our degradation. Let us tear up by its deepest roots, its deepest trees of prejudice. Recruit some, persuade others, promise, menace, threaten, drag in your wake the decent white citizens. But above all, dear friends, unity, courage, and speed. Bring arms. What's it? Is it baggage, cannon, munitions of war, and provisions, and come at once to rally under the common standard? It is there that we all ought to perish, or take vengeance for God, nature, law, and humanity, so long outraged in these climates of horror. Regard's brother wrote to his friends, quote, I fly to vengeance. If my fate is not death on this expedition, I shall come back soon to join you. Long live liberty, long live equality, long live love, end quote. Rich whites and royalist commandants followed the biracial people, but the Regard brothers, Bouvanas and Penchenet, despite his treatment of the Swiss, were genuine revolutionaries, putting liberty before property. In a frenzy of execution and rage, they summoned the slaves of the West Province and drew them into the revolution. In the advanced north, the slaves were leading the biracial peoples. In the backward west of biracial peoples were leading the slaves. It does not need much wisdom to foresee the consequences. In the South, whites and biracial people were on the point of forming a concordant in the model of the West. All terms had been agreed upon when Carrado paid a visit to the South and intrigued so successfully that the unity agreement was broken. As soon as the news of the split of Port-au-Prince reached them, biracial people and whites each took to arms. The biracial people made themselves masters of Jacmel, the other towns. In self-defense, the whites in the South, outnumbered by the biracial people, raised the slaves. In the North, some biracial people and white proprietors formed a concordant. The assembly disallowed it as these biracial peoples joined the slaves. The whites committed frightful atrocities against the biracial people. They killed a pregnant woman, cut the baby out, and threw it into the flames. They burnt them alive. They inoculated them with smallpox. Naturally, the biracial people retaliated in kind. But here, as everywhere, the white planters began it, and exceeding all rivals of barbarism, being trained in violence and cruelty by their treatment of the slaves. This was the San Domingo that the third commissioners, Saint Ledger, Mirbeck, and Romu, were to restore to order when they landed in Le Cap on November 29th, 1971. They were welcomed by an assembly and installed with an imposing ceremony. They issued a proclamation, mendaciously announced the near arrival of large bodies of troops. To their surprise and joy, this seems as if it would work a miracle. Basu, Jean Francisco, and the other black leaders, including Toussaint, after 4 months of insurrection, had come to a dead end. An insurrection must win victories, and the whites were content to hold the line of fortification known as the Cauldron of the West and prevent the insurrection penetrating into the West Province. The former slaves could devastate the country around, but that very devastation was making it impossible for them to exist. Famine began to kill them off. Frightened at what they considered their hopeless position and afraid of being beaten to submission, Jean Francisco and Basu offered peace to the commissioners in return for liberty of a few hundred leaders. Hold on a second. Just want to check something. I think we're on chapter 4. Thank you. Jean Francisco knew that it was a betrayal, false principles, quote unquote, wrote his 4-month-old labor leader, quote, "We'll make these slaves very obstinate. They will say that they have been betrayed," end quote. But if the commissioner granted liberty to those who were named, they would cooperate with the king's troops and hunt down those who refused to submit. Jean Francisco knew that the businesses would be difficult and dangerous, and said as much, proof of the passion for liberty which filled the hearts of black people. But he was prepared to do all that he could to help and to soothe his conscience, wrote disloyally of his followers as a multitude of black people from Africa who did not know 2 words of French. In a long and cruel list of leaders betrayed brave but ignorant masses, this stands high, and Toussaint was in it up to the neck. Though working in a subordinate position, he took the leading part in the negotiations and the masterpiece of diplomatic correspondence, which the envoy of the slaves presented at the bar of the assembly, showed the distance between the men who, a few weeks before, had asked the whites to leave the island and the already fully fledged political maturity of Toussaint. To the end of his days, he could hardly speak French. He literally could not write 3 words without the grotesque errors in spelling and grammar. Years afterwards, when he was master of San Domingo, he wrote thus to Dessalines. Je vasu y parlu pour la folie barti à vous deri. He meant to write, Je vous parler de forte liberté aventure. It's all French, sorry. He could never do better. But he dictated in the local bastard French or Creole, and his secretaries wrote and rewrote until he got the exact meaning he wanted. The letter begins by emphasizing that the king's proclamation was formally accepted, the French Constitution, and, quote, very clearly and precisely. He asked for the spirit of justice, of moderation, to help in the restoration of the country, which was suffered from the repeated shock of a great revolution. This conciliatory spirit should cross the law related to the colonies of September 28th, 1791. Jesus. This law gives to the colonies the right of deciding on the status of the free men of color and free black people. Hold on a second. Just want to look at something. Holy yapping! Oh my gosh. I like it when they say that. Okay. Toussaint and other traders wanted not only freedom, but political rights. But promises were not enough. They would defend the decision of the colonial assemblies, quote, to the last drop of their blood, end quote. But their decisions must be, quote, clothed with a requisite formalities. Followed a long apology for the evil which they had helped to inflict, quote, on this rich and important colony, end quote. But they had not known for the new laws when they had written the first letter, quote, today, when we are instructed in the new laws today, we cannot doubt the what's that word? Approbation?
Yes.
Sweet. Of the mother country of all the legislative acts that we will decree concerning the interior regime of the colony and the status of citizens, we shall not show ourselves refractory. After another long appeal to the assembly to seize this opportunity to the reestablished order promptly, quote, in so important a colony, the letter touched on the difficult questions of the slaves, quote, the law which will be in force concerning the status of a person free and not free ought to be the same in the whole colony, end quote. This was obviously a finger pointing to the concordance of the West Providence, quote, it would be even to our interest if you declare by a decree bearing the sanction of the governor that it is our intention to concern yourself with a lot of the slaves. Know that they are the object of your solicitude. Yeah. Insomuch as the slaves had confidence in their chiefs, if the assembly gave the job of pacification to these chiefs, the slaves would be satisfied, which would facilitate restoration of, quote, the equilibrium which has been broken, end quote. The conclusion was, what is that? Protestation?
Yep.
Of good faith and desire for the speedy settlement. Freedom for the leaders, however, was indispensable. The letter was signed by Jean Francisco and Vassou, 2 others, and 2 commissioners ad hoc one of whom was Toussaint, in its skillful use of both the moral and political connection between the mother country and the colony. It's dangling before the colonists the chance to restore the former prosperity, quote, of this great and important colony. This firm but delicate insistence of political rights, duly certified by law for the free men, its luxuriance whenever it dealt with things that cost nothing, such as peace, goodwill, etc. The letter could have come from the pen of a man who had spent all his life in diplomacy. The writer, knowing the temper of the colonists, had even taken the trouble to suggest that to them exactly how the slaves were to be bluffed back into bondage. No imperialist of today, with 300 years of traditional deception behind him, could have garlanded his claws with fairer words. Quote, the restoration of the broken equilibrium, end quote, as a phrase for slavery would not have disgraced the mandates commissioned of the League of Nations. John Francisco had written that the thing was difficult, but it could be done, and that they were not only prepared, but able to do their Judas work. The letter gave ample evidence. Political treachery is not a monopoly of the white race, and this abominable betrayal, so soon after the insurrection, shows that political leadership is a matter of program, strategy, and tactics, and not the color of those who lead it. Their oneness of origin with their people, nor the services they have rendered. The high and mighty colonialists refuse. Treat with these brigades, who had murdered and burnt and great. Impossible. In vain the commissioners protested. The colonialists, supremely confident that they would without difficulty drive these revolting dogs back to their kennels, answered that they would grant pardon only to repentant criminals who returned to work. The message ended with the terrorist request to the envoy, get out. The white colonists could not understand that Bassao was no longer a slave, but a leader of 40,000 men. When he got this message, he lost his temper. And remember, the white prisoners, quote, I shall make them pay for their insolence of the assembly, which has dared to write to me with so little respect, and ordered them all to be killed. Toussaint, always a hater of unnecessary bloodshed, calmed his chief. The disappointed commissioner arranged an interview with Jean Francisco. The colonial assembly accused them of plotting counter-revolution. The commissioner invited them to send delegates. At the appointed place and time, Jean Francisco appeared leading his horse by the bridle. At the sight of him, M. Buffett, a colonist, was so empowered with rage that he struck him with a riding whip. Jean Francisco, fiercely angry, fell back on his own band, and peace hung on a thread. At this dangerous moment, Saint Leger had the quick wittiness and courage to advance along among the hostile black people and speak to them kindly. So moved were they that this unexpected behavior of John Francisco threw himself at the feet of a man from France. He reiterated his promise for the freedom of 400 of the leaders, and the forgetfulness of the past. He would lead the black people back to slavery. The commissioner asked him as a guarantee of good faith to return the white prisoners. He agreed and asked to return for his wife, a prisoner in Le Cap, whom the whites had not dared to execute for fear of reprisal. The interview ended amicably. Jean Francisco assuring the commissioner that he was, quote, touched to see at last white men who showed humanity, end quote. Next day, he sent the promised prisoner to Le Cap, but black people had probably got to know that something was in the wind. The prisoners were under the strong escort, including Toussaint, which was scarcely sufficient to save them from the hostility of those they met on the way. The members of the delegation presented themselves at the bar of the assembly. The president would not even speak to them, but communicated with them only by note. Quote, to continue to give proof of your repentance and say to those who send you to address themselves to the commissioner, it is only by their intercession that the assembly can come to a decision on your fate. He wanted to impress on black people that the commissioner were subordinate to the assembly, and he succeeded. So disdainful was the assembly that it would not include the negotiation in the minutes. Toussaint had plenary powers, and in a vain attempt to break down the pride of the colonists, he secretly reduced the numbers to be freed from 400 to 60. The colonialists would not hear of it. Then and only then Toussaint came to an unalterable decision, from which he never wavered and for which he died. Complete liberty for all, to be attained and held by their own strength. The most extreme revolutionaries are formed by circumstances. It is probable that looking at the wild hordes of black people who surrounded him, his heart sank at the prospects of the war and the barbarism which would follow freedom, even if it were achieved. He was already to go a long way to meet the colonists. He probably hoped for some attempt at better treatment, but having been driven to take his decision as was his way, he never looked back. On this return, he told his chiefs not to look to the commissioners for anything. They had only a faculty of intercession, and their powers were subordinate to those of the assembly. Basua, who had demanded an interview, invaded it. Henceforth, it was war. The war needed trained soldiers. Toussaint dropped his post of physician to the armies of the king and assumed the title of brigadier general, starting to train an army. Once only in his political life did he ever fail to meet the emergency with which bold and correct. In the West Province, Regard and Bavuvas and Penachanet, I can't say this, were using as their agents and the gangs and young slaves named, oh my gosh, Hyacinth. Hyacinth. He was only 21 years of age, but he went from plantation to plantation, claiming, as most leaders of agricultural revolt, that he was divinely inspired. He could judge the backwardness of the Western slaves at the beginning of the revolution from the fact that both how you say it again? How do you say it again?
Hyacinth.
And another Romanian and prophetess, fortified their authority with divine attributes, while Jean Francisco and Basu in the north, from the very beginning, aimed at a social revolution. Black people flocked to join the Confederate army of biracial people and whites at La Crosse des Banquets. And on March 31st, the battle between the Confederates and the Patriots of Port-au-Prince took place. The slaves were nearly all native-born Africans, armed only with knives, picks, hoes, and sticks of iron points. They went into battle, led by Hyacinth, They charged the bayonets of Port-au-Prince volunteers and the French soldiers without fear and care for the volleys from Parletto's cannons, which tore their ranks. If they were killed, they would wake again. In Africa, Hyacinthi, a bull's tail in his hand, ran from rank to rank, crying that his talisman would chase death away. He charged at their head, passing unscathed through the bullets and the grape shot. Under such leadership, the Africans were irresistible. They clutched at the horses and of the dragoons and pulled off the riders. They put their arms down into the mouths of the cannon in order to pull out the bullets, and called to their comrades, "Come, come, we have them." The cannons were discharged and blew them to pieces, but others swarmed over the guns and gunners, threw their arms around them, and silenced them. Nothing could stop their devotion. And after 6 hours, the troops of Port-au-Prince retired and in disorder. They had lost over hundreds of soldiers, but nearly 2,000 slaves lay dead upon the field. The combined army then invested Port-au-Prince. The whites were not only fighting with biracial people, but were petitioning the governor to prevent disruptors of the peace coming from the colonial assembly to disrupt the West. He sent them the concordance. They said they would stick to them, whatever he said. They asked him to publish them, to send them to the king, to the legislative in France, to the merchants of the great ports, to everybody. Whatever the reservation they had made when they formed this pact with the bastard biracial peoples, the whites were now eager to cement the alliance, and Ramun was overwhelmed by the number of these appeals. Revolution, says Karl Marx, is the locomotive of history. Here was a locomotive that had traveled at remarkable speeds in April 1792, not yet 3 years after the fall of the Bastille. The white patriots in Port-au-Prince were being besieged by a composite army of royalist commandants, white planters, brown-skinned biracial people, and black slaves, none of them constrained, but all for the time being free and equal partners. No doubt most of the rich were only awaiting the restoration of, quote, order, to put the slaves back in their place again. But a mere fact of the revolution association and the temporary equality meant that the old spell was broken and things would never be the same again. The colonial assembly, in addition to war with the slaves and war with biracial people, has started a fierce row with the commissioners over precedents. In Le Cap, the patriots actually had the governor under arrest for some time and were plotting to murder Meerbeck, who sailed for home on February 30th. St. Leger had gone to Port-au-Prince. The patriots there, spurred on by the assembly in Le Cap, threatened to deport him, and he took refuge with the Confederates. St. Leger and Ramun were now seriously alarmed, not at revolting slaves, but at the growth of the counter-revolution. In the same way as Barnave and Lamens and their friends in France, white San Domingo was growing tired of the red cockade and began to look once more to the royal authority. The Confederate army seemed all white cockade, but just at this time, Penchnet, which is a person, had a meeting with St. Leger, and that he told that gentleman made him fly post haste to France. Ramun also was due to leave 3 days after, but in a chance conversation, he smelt a royalist plot and stayed to ward it off. The royalists indeed thought that San Domingo was now ripe for the picking, but they were mistaken. The pensionat had played an astute game. The royalists had hoped to use the biracial peoples. Now they found that they had been used instead, as Bovinus told Ramun afterward, quote, "We were never the dupes of the white Concades. We had to conquer our rights. We needed auxiliaries. If the devils had presented himself, we would have enrolled him. These gentlemen offered, and we used them, while allowing them to believe that we were their dupes." The decree on April 4th now came to clinch the victory of the biracial people and allow the nerves and exhausted the constituent. All of those members were excluded by law for the legislative, which met on October 1st. New deputies were no better off as far as colonialist questions was concerned. For in addition to the rights of man for biracial people, they now faced a slave revolt. Let me see what it says. Analyzing the letter of, okay, cool. Summary: the Haitian Revolution, early battles, and its social impacts. Nice. On the right where the, oh my gosh, Fulentents, or King's Party led the colonial question by, oh my gosh, Von Bloch, who approved the conditions of slaves, even biracial people. The left was stronger since the election, but though they were over the 100 Jacobins, deputies and legislative, they were split. On the extreme left, where Rosenspire and the mountain on the right were the Bressontins, or followers of Bressot, better known in history as a Girardins. I'm going to find out what that means. Be right back. One more word after this. Let's see, Erman. So it won't let me say the word, but we'll look at it, see if it showed up. Did it show up? So that's that. A moderate Republican political faction during the French Revolution that championed liberal policies, private property, and provincial influence against Paris-driven racism. Okay, cool. We're gonna look at one more thing. Be right back, everybody. I'm gonna look at, let's see here. See if I can find the word real quick. Maybe if I come across it again, I'll look it up. Okay, everybody. This Paris masses hold on a second. Oh my God. Damn it. Thank God. Okay. Okay, where was I? Okay, there we go. The Paris masses organized in the Commune were following the Jacobins. Rosenspire, Perry, and the Mountain would fight for biracial rights. So would Bressot, but Bressot's group was composed of Vergenade, Gaudet, and other actual deputies of the maritime towns. The Girardins were so called after the Gironde province, whose chief town was Bordeaux. Vergenade was deputy of Bordeaux, and all the maritime towns were still firmly against the rights of man for biracial people. What fight What first frightened them was the way the news of the insurrection reached France. Paris heard of it from the English paper. The English ambassador gave information about the seriousness of the uprising. He had got it from Jamaica through London. The Monseigneur, day after day, asked, why no news from de Blanchy-Lady? On November 7th, the Monseigneur, Moniteur, printed a copy of the letter of the colonialists had written to the governor of Jamaica. Only on the 8th was a letter from de Blanchy-Lady asked for troops read in the house. The maritime bourgeoisie began to look at these colonialists with a different eye. The biracial people, at least, were faithful to France, and they were strong supporters of slavery. The first question was for troops to quell the revolt. But in the revolution comes first. Right and left wing of the legislative wanted to know how many troops were to be sent and who would control them. The king was still head of the army and navy. The officers were royalists and centers of the counter-revolution. The king's minister and officials were still functioning in Paris and in San Domingo. To put an army and a fleet into the hands of these people was to be putting weapons which, after the suppression of the insurrection perhaps before, might be used against the revolution itself and place the richest colony of France entirely in royalist hands. Hold on a second. Okay. All right. Jacobins and, oh my gosh, Fulantins fought it out day after day. But though it was a question of repressing a slave revolt, the legislative, like the constituent, would not tolerate the use of the word slave. When the deputy in the course of speech happened to say, quote, but the slaves are the property of the colonists, they were the usual protests and demands that the speaker be called in to order. The legislative, more to the left, was perhaps for this commission, wishing as usual to have everything settled in the ministry, would not make any report. But the friends of black people were far more powerful now, and Broussat gave warning. If the commission did not present its report in 10 days, he was going to open the debate on December 1st. During the interval, delegates from the Colonial Assembly arrived in Paris and on November 30th, one of them, Mullet, was the colonialist case. It is probable that never in any parliamentary assembly was so much impudent lying and dishonesty packed into one single speech. Mullet's description of slavery proved it to be the happiest form of society known to either ancient and modern times. Quote, we live in peace, gentlemen, in the midst of our slaves. Let an intelligent and educated man compare to the horrible state of these men in Africa with the pleasant and easy life which they enjoy in the colonies, sheltered by all the necessities of life, surrounded with the ease unknown in the greater part of the countries of Europe, secure in the enjoyment of their property, for they had property and it was cared for, and in their illness, with the expense and the attention that you would seek in vain in hospital so boasted of in England, protected, respected in the infirmities of age and in peace, with their children and their family, freed when they had rendered important services. Such was the picture, true and not embellished, of the government of our black people. And this domestic government perfected itself particularly during the last 10 years, with the care of which you find no model in Europe. The most sincere attachment bound the masters to the slaves. We slept in safety in the middle of these men who had become our children, and many among us had neither lock nor bolt in our doors. End quote. That was a horrible speech. This was supposed to be a lot. This was supposed to be a lot of the slaves up to 1787, the year before the La Jeune case. Terror to keep the slaves in subjection, attested in 1,000 documents. No such thing. True, there were a small number of hard and ferocious masters. Quote, but what was a lot of these wicked men? Branded by public opinion, looked upon with horror by all these honest people, shout out from all society, without credit of their business. They lived in, oh my gosh, opprobrium and dishonor, and died in misery and despair. What was it that changed this idyllic state of affairs? At this point enter the villain. However, gentlemen, quote, a society that takes shape in the blossom of France and prepares from afar the destruction of the convulsions to which we are subjected. Far from being able to continue with our work, this society forced us to renounce it by sowing the spirit of insubordination among our slaves and anxiety among us. Having hurled his bombs at the friends of black people, Millet turned to the assembly itself. He knew the tender spot. Quote, soon they say the society will demand that the slave trade be suppressed. That is to say, that the profits which can result from it for French commerce will be delivered to foreigners. For never will this romantic philosophy persuade all the powers of Europe that it is their duty to abandon the cultivation of the colonies and to leave the inhabitants of Africa to pray to the barbarity of their tyrants rather than employ them themselves. Under kind masters, they exploit a territory which would remain uncultivated without them, and of which the rich production are for the nation which processes them a great source of industry and prosperity. The biracial peoples, they and the whites have lived peaceably, nay happily. Quote, the bonds of affection and of good feelings which exist between these two classes of men, end quote, would be strengthened by the just humane laws and colonial assemblies would pass. But here too, the friends of black people falsely represented the attitude of the whites as a pretensions of vanity and an endeavor to resist this just claims. But no man can keep it up forever, least of all men trained in the French intellectual tradition. Before Millet included his suddenly let slip the elegant drapery and gave a glimpse of white San Domingo in all of its bloated nakedness. Quote, these coarse men, black people, are incapable of knowing liberty and enjoying it with wisdom, and the prudent law which would destroy their prejudice would be for them and for us a decree of death, end quote. The legislator listened in silence. This is no juggling with words. Slavery was the thing itself, presented to the bourgeoisie for their endorsement through all eternity. Jaures notes that there was no applause, none even of those disgusted interruptions with which the legislative was wont to express its disapproval to the mere word slavery. When Millet was finished, the president invited the delegates to the honors of the session. But this was too much. One of the extreme left jumped up in rage. Quote, what? Mr. President, you invite to the session men who have just outraged philosophy and liberty, men who have just insulted, end quote. But the profits of the slave trade, too much for the assembly, and the left it itself had no heart for this business. Next day, Borsat took the floor and on behalf of the biracial people made a masterly and celebrated speech. He showed the rich whites anxious to have peace and ready to give political rights to the biracial people, the patriots, for the most part heavily indebted to France and bent to independence, jealous of the biracial peoples who did not owe, the determined to maintain the privilege of race, all the more dear to them in that it rests now on such insecure foundations. Quote, it is by this that we explain the existence all that the same time in the heart of the same colonist, of hatred against men of color, claims his rights against the merchants who claim his debts, against the free government, which wishes that justice be done all. God, another appeal. Okay. Once more, the bourgeoisie battled over biracial rights. This time, the contest lasted for weeks, in and out of the house. Von Black took the place of the absent Bernave, but a friend of black people had a new argument in the concordance between whites and biracial people. In the maritime bourgeoisie were now convinced that the only way to save the colony was to give the biracial people their rights. The negotiation of the patriots with their countries had opened their eyes as to the real nature of these gentlemen. Vernad and Gadant were able to convince their patrons that the old policy was false. The great ship owners, merchants, and traders threw over the colonialists. Bernave group, the Foulants, formed the governing ministry, but the revolution was taking courage again. The Foulants were overthrown on March 10th, and the Gordon ministry came in with Roland at its head, by Madame Roland and Borsat as its leading spirit. On March 24th, by a large majority, the legislative passed a decree giving full political rights to men of color. Some tried to argue that decision of the constituents were sacrosanct, but the deputies on the left, to the accompaniment, how's that word go?
It looks like a companion.
Can I go? I'm gonna go look it up just to make sure.
Yeah.
Accompaniment. It's accompaniment of a great applause. Challenge the theory that the legislative was forever bound by the decrees of the constituents, and boldly asserted the sovereignty of the people over the rights of formal assemblies. 3 new commissioners were appointed with supreme power and large forces to enforce the decree and restore order. And on April 4th, the king's signature made the decree law. But what of the slaves? The slaves had revolt for freedom. The revolt was to be suppressed, but at least there might be a promise of pardon, of kind treatment in the future. Not a word, neither from Volblanc on the right nor Rosenspierre on the left. Rosenperry made an ass of himself by violently objecting to the word slavery when proposed as a substitute for non-free. Borsat made a passing reference to them as being unfortunate, and that as all was all. Quote, the cause of the men of color is when the cause of the patriots of the of the old Third Estate, and finally, of the people so long oppressed. So had spoken Brissot, and Brissot, representative of the Third Estate, was prepared to help the Third Estate of the biracial people and give the people in France as well as in San Domingo phrases. The French peasants were still clamoring for the assembly to relieve them of the feudal dues. The Brissotins would not do it. They would not touch property, and the slaves were property. Blagetti, a deputy, proposed a motion for gradual enfranchisement. I can't say enfranchisement. The legislative would not even discuss it. On March 26, 2 days after the decree in favor of the biracial people, Dacus dared to propose that every biracial child be free, quote, whenever the status of its mother, end quote. The legislative in wrath voted the previous questions, and Dacus was not even allowed to speak on his motion. The friends of black people, good liberals, were now in power and were as silent about slavery as any colonialist. The slaves arrogant of politics had been right not to wait on these eloquent phrase makers. Toussaint, that astute student of French politics, read and noted. Toussaint, alone among the black leaders, with freedom for all in his mind, was in those early months of 1792 organizing out of the thousands of ignorant and untrained black people in an army capable of fighting European troops. Let me go. Can you remember page 127? I'm gonna look ahead. Ooh, actually, we might end a little early tonight because it looks like no reason to start another chapter. All right, here we go. The insurgents had developed a method of attack based on their overwhelming numerical superiority. They did not rush forward in mass formation like fanatics. They placed themselves in groups, choosing wooden spots in such a way as to envelop their enemy, seek to rush him by weight of numbers. They carried out these preliminary maneuvers in dead silence, while their priests, the black people, chanted, and the wagan, and the women and children sang and danced in frenzy. When these were reached, the necessary height of excitement, the fighters attacked. If they met with resistance, they retired without exhausting themselves. But at the slightest hesitation in the defense, they became extremely bold and rushed up to the cannon, swarmed all over their opponents. At first, they could not even use the guns they captured, used to apply the match at the wrong end. It was from these men, unable to speak 2 words of French, quote unquote, that an army had to be made. Toussaint could have had thousands follow him. It is characteristics of him that he began with a few hundred picked men devoted to himself, who learnt the art of war with him from the beginning as they fought side by side against the French troops and the colonialists. In camp, he drilled trained them assiduously. Do you know the word? Assiduously. Yeah. By July 1792, he had no more than 500 attached to himself, the best of the revolutionary troops. These, and not the rotations. What's that word? Never seen that word. Let's go look up this word. narration. Like the concluding part of a speech. Okay. In the legislative would be decisive in the struggle for freedom, but nobody took much notice of Toussaint and his black followers, Foulants and Jacobins in France. Whites and biracial people in San Domingo were still looking upon the slave revolt as a huge riot, which would be put down in time once the division between the slave owners was closed. And we'll stop there. I know it's 15 minutes early, but it just makes sense. We're stopping on page 129, chapter 5. I'm gonna write this down, everybody. God. So they went to France to plead, and they had two things: get rid of the word of slavery, and to stop and to give biracial people rights. And then, like, they were sitting there waiting at San Domingo to get ready for the revolutionary fight. It seems like.
Yeah, they were
preparing for
training.
it. What?
They were training.
Yep.
They had started
preparing
training.
for it. Yep. And good thing that Toussaint was there because he could speak French, so he was able to understand the letter.
As Toussaint couldn't speak French. He spoke French very poorly with a lot of spelling and grammar errors.
Was able to read that letter just fine to understand what's going on, though. So
yeah, they didn't talk about him not being able to read it, but he couldn't speak, spell, or do the grammar.
Yeah, I was talking about him reading it. It was a good thing that he could read it. So the next chapter will be, and the Paris Mass is complete. All right. And they did mention a little bit about, like, the peasants were waiting for to be basically taken out of being the peasantry and put into wage slavery. It's weird. So yeah, a lot of things going on here and stuff like that. Does anybody have any questions that listened? Anybody want to come up and talk?
I don't really have any questions, but I did really enjoy the reading this time as we got into it. And it was interesting hearing how they just lied to their legislative body, and then they were like cold on it. Like no one clapped or cheered or jeered them or anything. They just stared at them. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, then. Well, since no one has anything, then thank you for that. Yeah. As a huge, just lying to maintain their power and status because they were making tons of money off of it, tons of profit. Because they kept saying it was one of the richest colonies of France, you know? So, like, of course, they want to maintain that in some ways. But, like, even, like, a liberal phrase of, like, we just want to get rid of the word slavery, but we'll make it a different word, but it'll be the same thing. It's like, what? It's liberalness right there, you know? Make it sound pretty, but it's really the same thing, you know? So, right.
Yeah. But okay then. Well, I'll go ahead and I'll close it down. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we'll do this again.